Hello everyone, this is Dr. Lashik. And in this chapter, for chapter 4, I'm going to go over a couple of historical examples that are not only important to know about because we can reference them as we talk about the core ethical principles in psychology, but also because they are what led us to make these core ethical principles. So we are bound to treat our participants with respect, kindness, and fairness, and to ensure that our research is meaningful and helpful to society. If it doesn't meet these standards, we shouldn't be conducting it. So these rules seem pretty obvious. So you probably are asking yourself, why do we even have these rules? Well, we have these rules because we've messed up in our history several times when doing experiments, and these screw-ups have forced us to create very stringent standards of ethical conduct. There are two really great examples of this that we will cover in this lecture. Number one is the Tuskegee syphilis study, and number two is Milgram's obedience study. The Tuskegee syphilis study is the one we'll start with, and it is not a psychology study. It is a medical study, but it is still really important to talk about here. So the Tuskegee syphilis study, that was conducted in the 1920s. Scientists were concerned that poor black men in the South had higher rates of syphilis than any other group. And at this time, syphilis was largely untreatable. The treatments that did exist for syphilis were ineffective and actually more dangerous than just living with syphilis. And as we know now, living with syphilis and leaving it untreated is fatal. So scientists worked with the Tuskegee Institute of Alabama to study the effects of treatments, various treatments that they were testing, versus no treatments of syphilis. They recruited African American men in Tuskegee, 2/3 of which already had syphilis. And unfortunately, these participants that were recruited were very enthusiastic about participating because they thought they were finally getting treatment for this unknown ailment that they were suffering from. So to study the progression of syphilis, the scientists followed those African American participants who had it and studied them until they died of their condition. They did not inform the men about their disease. The scientists withheld that information, telling them that instead they had bad blood, and that the clinic visits that they were experiencing, which were really where they monitored the progression of their illness, was actually treatment, when in reality they did not receive any treatment whatsoever. They were just being studied for the progression of syphilis. Some of the clinic visits included very dangerous procedures like spinal taps, because as we now know, in its latest stages, syphilis gets into the bones. Another problem was that when effective treatments became available, like penicillin, the researchers withheld that information from the participants to continue studying the progression of the disease. Some people raised concerns that this was occurring, but their concerns were ignored. Years later, after the completion of the experiment, families of the participants sued the government for allowing the study to be carried out as long as it had, and as it had, with the procedures that were used. There are 3 major ethical violations of the Tuskegee experiment. And you'll see these same ethical violations corrected for when you learn about the standards of ethical conduct, both from the APA and the Belmont Report. So number 1, respect to participants was violated. This was violated because the men were lied to about the nature of the study. If they had been given informed consent, they could have decided on their own about participation after being given the facts about the purpose of the study. The second issue is that they harmed the participants. The men were harmed because after the penicillin was developed, the men were not told and were kept from getting better. Also, the tests that they underwent were sometimes very dangerous and painful and did not benefit them in any way. And the third violation is that it targeted a disadvantaged social group. So syphilis impacts people of all ethnicities and all socioeconomic statuses, yet researchers only studied poor African Americans, putting only them at extreme risk, when all people would have benefited from this experiment and therefore should have undergone the risks associated with it. All right, so the second historical example is Milgram's obedience study. So while the Tuskegee study represents very obvious violations of ethics, a lot of psychology experiments are less clear about whether or not they've actually been unethical. Social psychology is a big violator of ethics in this way because it's kind of muddy whether or not you want to decide if this is an ethical violation or not. And the two most obvious examples of psychology experiments gone wrong are Milgram's obedience study and the Stanford prison experiment. So we'll just talk about Milgram's obedience study today. So in Milgram's obedience study, participants were told, excuse me, participants were told that they were going to be participating in a learning experiment where the researchers would be measuring the effects of using shocks on learning. So someone would be learning something, and as a punishment for not learning it, they would be receiving a shock. The participant was assigned the role as the teacher, and the learner was another fake participant. The learner was part of the experiment and was faking their role. This is also known in social psychology terms as a confederate, so someone who's just a stand-in as another participant or faking their role for the purpose of the study. The experimenter wore a white lab coat and stood behind the participant during the study. The confederate was in a different room, unseen to the participant. The confederate had to pair words by memory, and if they got an answer wrong during those pairings, the participant was supposed to shock the learner with increasing voltages for each wrong answer. Since the confederate was part of the experiment, they really weren't actually receiving any shocks, even though the participant was led to believe that they were. As the participant continued the experiment, the confederate would start to protest that the shocks were too painful and would ask that the experiment stop. If the participant continued, they would begin screaming in pain, and if the participant still continued, they would be completely unresponsive after certain voltages. If the participant protested to the experimenter that they wanted to stop the experiment themselves, the experimenter would egg on the participant to continue. So in reality, they were not actually measuring learning, the ability of the learner to learn words with shocking. They were measuring the obedience of the participant to the experimenter. And surprisingly, 65% of the participants continued the experiment to the end. Different variations of this experiment yielded slightly different percentages. So when the learner was in the same room as the participant, there was less obedience. When the experimenter was in a different room than the participant, there was less obedience. And so lots of different variations of the same experiment. There are some, of course, ethical issues of the Milgram experiment. Number one being the participants were under extreme stress. So as the experiment continued, they reduced these previously confident businessmen to nervous wrecks, who ended up muttering that they wanted to stop but continued as they were urged to. So that's really not a good situation. Also, there could have been long-lasting negative effects to the participants. So even though each participant was carefully debriefed after the experiment was over, in other words, they were carefully told of the true hypothesis of the study and introduced to the unharmed learner, the knowledge still remained that they were willing to fatally harm someone because they were urged to by someone of authority. And this can be quite upsetting in the long run. So when you learn about all these different ethical standards and negative historical examples, and you might be wondering to yourself, how do I make the decision that what I'm doing is ethical to be completed? And so what you need to ask yourself constantly is, you're basically a scale, two scales balancing back and forth, and you have to decide if the benefits to society outweigh the risks to participants. And that tells you whether or not it's worth conducting that research. So, for instance, Milgram knew what kind of stress he was inflicting on his participants, after his first run-through of the experiment, he could see very obviously that the participants were reduced to tears and being upset. And yet he did not revise his procedures to accommodate this. He decided to continue on. In his mind, the benefits of his experiment outweighed the risks to the participants. And so we have to ask ourselves, should he have continued? Well, there's a lot of benefits. This is excellent information about the power of the situation and people's obedience to authority. We would not have learned this information without this unethical research that was conducted. However, there are risks. They had potentially harmed participants by putting such stress on them. So again, every experiment, even completely neutral experiments, have to be weighed whether or not we're putting someone at risk and the benefits to society. Because even experiments that have no ethical violations, if the results don't benefit society in any way whatsoever, we are wasting our participants' time by researching that. And so this question of balance needs to be asked about every research study that is conducted. All right, if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to email me.